December 7th, 1944, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. 23-year-old Obergefreiter Werner Hoffman crouched behind the shattered trunk of an oak tree, his hands so cold he could barely feel the metal of his carabiner. Around him, what remained of his company, 11 men out of the original 42, huddled in foxholes that offered little protection from either the bitter wind or the American artillery that had been pounding their position for the past 6 hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The wedding ring on his left hand felt heavy. He'd been married 8 months. 8 months, 3 weeks and 4 days to be exact. Anna's photograph sat in the inside pocket of his tunic, wrapped in waxed paper to protect it from the wet. He touched it. Now, a habit he'd developed, making sure it was still there. In the photo, she stood in front of her parents' house in Heidelberg, smiling in the way she always smiled, like she knew a secret the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. The American voices were getting closer. English words he couldn't understand, sharp commands echoing through the trees. Werner's sergeant, a veteran from the Eastern Front named Kraus, crawled over to his position. His face was grey with exhaustion. And something else. Resignation, maybe. Acceptance. "It's over," Kraus said quietly. "The Americans have us surrounded. We can try to break through, but half of us will die in the attempt. Or we can surrender." In the 1930s and early 40s, Werner had been taught what surrender to the Americans meant. He'd seen the propaganda films, heard the lectures. The Americans were gangsters and criminals in uniform. They came from a mongrel nation with no honor, no culture, no respect for the laws of war. They tortured prisoners, shot them in ditches. The Jews who'd fled to America had poisoned the American mind against Germans. "Expect no mercy from them," his training officer had said. "They will treat you like animals, because that is what they are." Animals. Werner thought about the ring. He thought about the photograph. If he was going to die anyway, he wanted these things with him. Some part of Anna, some proof that he'd been loved, that his life had meant something beyond this frozen forest and this lost war. The decision was made for him. Private Müller, barely 18, stood up with his hands raised. Within seconds, the others followed. Werner watched them rise from their positions like ghosts, hands above their heads, weapons falling to the ground. Kraus looked at him, shrugged with bitter humor, and stood. Werner stood too. The American soldiers appeared from between the trees, weapons raised, barking commands. Werner understood none of the words, but all of the meaning. Don't move. Don't resist. Do exactly as you're told, or die. An American sergeant, his face hard and weathered, approached Werner directly. The sergeant was maybe 30, with eyes that had seen too much. He gestured at Werner's rifle. Werner let it fall. The sergeant patted him down, professional and thorough, checking for hidden weapons. When his hands found the photograph in Werner's tunic, Werner's heart seized. This is where it happens, he thought. This is where they take everything. The sergeant pulled out the waxed paper package, unfolded it, and looked at Anna's photograph. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Werner waited for mockery, for cruelty, for the photo to be ripped apart or thrown in the mud. The sergeant looked from the photo to Werner, then back to the photo. He folded it carefully back into the waxed paper and handed it back. Werner took the photograph with shaking hands. The sergeant had already moved on to search Müller, as if returning a German soldier's wedding photo was the most natural thing in the world. Werner stood there, stunned, holding Anna's picture and trying to understand what had just happened. Around him, the other prisoners were being searched, and their personal items, letters, photographs, small pocket Bibles, were being examined and returned. No one was being beaten. No one was being robbed. The Americans were following procedure, professional and impersonal. They were loaded onto trucks within the hour. 12 German soldiers squeezed into the back of a deuce and a half, guarded by 2 American privates who looked bored rather than vengeful. The truck bounced along frozen roads, heading west, away from the battle. Werner kept touching his pocket, checking the photograph, checking the ring, unable to believe they were still his. That was the first crack in the wall. The propaganda had promised one thing. Reality was delivering another. The processing center was a converted school building in a Belgian town whose name Werner never learned. They were herded into a large room with peeling paint and a pot-bellied stove that barely heated the space. An American lieutenant with a clipboard stood at the front, flanked by two guards. A translator, a German-speaking American, addressed them in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "You are now prisoners of war of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed, housed, and given medical care. Your names and capture information will be reported to the International Red Cross so your families can be notified you are alive. You will not be mistreated unless you attempt escape or attack American personnel. Do you understand?" The prisoners nodded, silent. Werner kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the reasonable words to be revealed as a trap. His father had told him stories about the Great War, about brutal treatment of German prisoners by the French and British. Surely the Americans were no different. One by one, they were called forward to a table where their information was recorded. Name, rank, serial number, unit, date of capture. When it was Werner's turn, the American clerk, a corporal with glasses and ink-stained fingers, filled out a card with careful penmanship. "Any personal items?" the translator asked. Werner hesitated. Was this the confiscation? Was this where they took everything under the guise of inventory? "One wedding ring," Werner said, finally. "One photograph." The translator relayed this to the clerk, who made a note on the card and slid it across the table for Werner to verify. The information was accurate. The ring and photograph were listed as his property. No one took them. No one demanded he hand them over for safekeeping. They were simply acknowledged as his and left with him. "You'll be moved to a camp in France, then likely to America," the translator said. "The ring and photos stay with you, unless you lose them yourself. Don't lose them." Werner was given a POW identification tag, a thin metal disc with his information stamped on it, and directed to another room where food was being served. Soup, bread, coffee, real coffee. Not the ersatz swill the Wehrmacht had been brewing from acorns and chicory. Werner ate slowly, watching the Americans, watching the other prisoners, trying to reconcile what he'd been taught with what he was experiencing. Kraus sat next to him, spooning soup with mechanical efficiency. "They let you keep your ring," he observed. Werner nodded. "They let everyone keep everything," Kraus continued. "I saw Muller still has his mother's rosary. Fischer has his harmonica. Either the Americans are fools, or we've been lied to about what happens when you surrender." "Maybe both," Werner said quietly. But he was beginning to suspect it was only the latter. The camp in France was a sprawling tent city outside Reims, housing thousands of German prisoners captured during the Ardennes offensive. It was overcrowded, cold, and muddy, but it was not brutal. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but they didn't beat prisoners for sport. Food was distributed daily, adequate if not generous. Medical tents treated the sick and wounded without discrimination. There was even a system for mail, allowing prisoners to send heavily censored postcards home through the Red Cross. Werner wrote to Anna on a pre-printed card that allowed 25 words. He chose them carefully. "I am alive and well. Captured by Americans. Being treated correctly. I think of you every day. I still have your photograph. Wait for me. I will come home. Werner." He didn't know if she'd receive it. He didn't know if she was even still alive. Heidelberg had been bombed repeatedly, but the act of writing, the possibility of connection, was its own form of comfort. The wedding ring became a source of fascination in the camp. Not all prisoners had been allowed to keep their personal items. Those captured by the Soviets lost everything, if they survived capture at all. Those taken by some French units had been robbed of watches, rings, anything valuable. But the Americans, consistently and almost bureaucratically, followed the Geneva Convention regulations. Personal items of non-military value will remain the property of the prisoner. It was written in the convention, and the Americans, with their peculiar obsession with following written rules, actually enforced it. Werner met a man in the camp, a Hauptmann named Dieter Hartmann, who'd been captured in Normandy 6 months earlier. Hartmann wore a gold wedding band and carried a leather wallet with photos of his 3 children. When Werner expressed surprise that these items hadn't been confiscated, Hartmann laughed. "The Americans are strange people," Hartmann said. "They care deeply about appearing civilized. They want to believe they are the good ones in this war. So they follow their rules with almost religious devotion. Your ring, my children's photos, these are sacred to us, yes? The Americans understand this. Or maybe they don't understand, but their rules say we get to keep them, so we keep them. Either way, we benefit." "But why?" Werner asked. "We're the enemy. Our country has killed thousands of Americans. Why do they care about our feelings?" Hartmann shrugged. "I have thought about this for 6 months. The best answer I can give is that the Americans are not fighting for hatred. They are fighting for principles, abstract ideas about freedom and democracy and human dignity. To violate those principles, even toward enemies, would undermine the entire justification for their war. So they treat us correctly, not because they like us, but because not doing so would make them into what they claim to be fighting against." It was the most sophisticated analysis Werner had heard, and it made uncomfortable sense. The propaganda had told them Americans were subhuman, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The Americans were, if anything, excessively human, bound by conscience and law in ways the Wehrmacht had long since abandoned. February 1945 brought transfer orders. Werner and 2,000 other prisoners were marched to a railroad siding and loaded onto freight cars for transport to the coast. The conditions were harsh, packed bodies, and limited sanitation, but they were given food and water at stops. No one was beaten. No one was left to die. When they reached Le Havre, they were loaded onto a Liberty ship bound for America. The voyage took 9 days. Werner spent most of it below deck, seasick and miserable, but alive. The American guards, mostly older men deemed unfit for combat, treated the prisoners with professional distance. Some were friendly, sharing cigarettes and attempting broken German conversations. Others were hostile, making clear they'd lost friends or brothers to German bullets. But even the hostile ones followed the rules. No beatings, no theft, no casual cruelty. When the ship entered New York Harbor and Werner saw the Statue of Liberty through a porthole, he felt a complicated tangle of emotions. Relief at surviving, shame at being a prisoner, awe at the scale of American power. The harbor was filled with ships, dozens of them, cargo vessels and warships and ferries. The city beyond was vast, untouched by bombing, lit up despite the war. This was the enemy homeland, and it was thriving while Germany burned. They were processed at Camp Shanks, north of New York City, with the same bureaucratic efficiency Werner had come to expect. Name, rank, serial number, personal effects inventory. His ring and photograph were noted again, still his property, still protected. Then they were loaded onto trains for distribution to work camps across America. Werner's train headed south and west, through landscapes he'd only seen in films. Pennsylvania farmland, Ohio industrial cities, Indiana plains. The sheer size of America was staggering. Hours and hours of travel, and they were still in the same country. Germany, all of Germany, could fit into a fraction of this space. How had anyone believed Germany could win a war against this? The work camp was in rural Indiana, surrounded by cornfields and small farming communities. It was a collection of wooden barracks, a mess hall, a small infirmary, and administrative buildings, all enclosed by a single fence with guard towers at the corners. Security was minimal. Where would they escape to? They were in the middle of nowhere, thousands of kilometers from Germany, in a country where they didn't speak the language. The camp commander, Captain Morrison, addressed the new arrivals in English, translated by a German-speaking sergeant. "You will work on local farms and in canning factories. You will be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Cooperate, and your time here will be tolerable. Cause trouble, and it will not be." Simple as that. The work was hard, but not barbaric. Werner was assigned to a farm owned by a man named Samuel Yoder, a Mennonite with a long beard and quiet manner. Yoder spoke some German. learned from grandparents who'd immigrated in the 19th century. He showed Werner and 3 other prisoners how he wanted the work done, planting spring crops, repairing fences, maintaining equipment, and then left them largely unsupervised. The guard, a corporal named Jenkins, sat in the shade and read a paperback Western novel. He carried a rifle, but Werner never saw him point it at anyone. After a few days, Jenkins stopped paying attention entirely. The prisoners weren't going to run. There was nowhere to go. At night, back in the barracks, Werner would take out Anna's photograph and study it by the light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Other prisoners did the same with their own photos, their letters, their small treasured objects. These items had become more than mere possessions. They were proof of identity, proof of a life beyond the wire, proof that someone, somewhere, loved them and waited for them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. One evening, a prisoner named Ernst approached Werner. Ernst was older, maybe 40, with the hard hands of a lifelong laborer. He'd been captured in Italy in 1943 and had spent nearly 2 years in American custody. "You still have your wedding ring," Ernst observed. Werner nodded. "You know why that matters," Ernst continued. "It's not just sentimentality, it's psychological. The Americans understand that if they take everything from us, if they strip us of our identity, we become dangerous. We become men with nothing to lose. But if we keep our rings, our photos, our small connections to home, we remain human. We remain men with something to protect, something to return to. It's a strategy, conscious or not." Werner considered this. "Is that why you think they do it? Strategic calculation." Ernst smiled sadly. "I think the Americans do it because their rules tell them to. They are a nation of rule followers. But the effect is the same. We are easier to manage when we have hope." The months blurred together. Spring became summer, became autumn. Werner worked Yoda's farm, planting, tending, harvesting. The physical labor was exhausting, but it was also meditative, a rhythm that left little room for thinking about the war or the uncertainty of the future. Yoda paid the prisoners their wages in camp scrip, which could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy, toiletries. Werner saved his money, not sure what he was saving for, but feeling the need to accumulate something. Letters arrived sporadically through the Red Cross. In June 1945, 3 months after Germany's surrender, Werner received a letter from Anna. The envelope had been opened and read by censors, but the letter inside was hers, her handwriting, her words. "My dearest Werner, I received your postcard in February. I cannot describe my relief knowing you are alive. Heidelberg has been bombed many times. Our apartment was destroyed in March. I am living with my parents now. Your mother and sister are well. They are in Stuttgart with your aunt. Everyone is surviving. Barely. There is no food. The Americans occupy our zone. They are not cruel, but they are not generous either. Germany is finished, Werner. Come home when you can. But I understand if it takes time. I still wear your ring. I look at your photograph every night. I love you. Wait for me as I wait for you. Anna." Werner read that letter until the paper began to tear at the folds. She was alive. She still loved him. She still wore his ring. The symmetry of it, both of them holding onto these symbols across an ocean, across a war, across an impossible distance, felt like a kind of magic. September brought news that some prisoners would begin repatriation. The process would be slow, prioritizing certain groups, farmers and engineers and skilled laborers who could help rebuild Germany. Combat soldiers, especially those who'd fought to the end, would wait longer. Werner, captured late in the war and with no special skills, would likely be among the last to leave. He didn't mind. America was strange, and he was a prisoner, but he was also safe and fed and allowed his dignity. The letters from Anna described conditions in Germany that sounded desperate: starvation, homelessness, the chaos of occupation. In Indiana, Werner had a bunk, 3 meals daily, and work that gave structure to his days. He could wait. October brought an incident that crystallized everything. A new, prisoner arrived at the camp, transferred from a different facility. His name was Ludwig, and he'd been captured by the Soviets in 1944, held in a camp in Ukraine for 9 months, then turned over to the Americans as part of some prisoner exchange arrangement. Ludwig had no wedding ring, no photographs, no personal possessions at all. The Soviets had taken everything, down to his belt and shoelaces. Ludwig stared at Werner's ring with naked envy. "They let you keep that?" he asked. Werner nodded. "The Americans let us keep everything. Personal items, anyway." Ludwig laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The Soviets took my wedding ring the day I was captured, ripped it off my finger, said gold was property of the Soviet people now. I haven't seen a photograph of my wife in over a year. I don't even know if she's alive." "The Americans, they're different. Completely different," Werner confirmed. "They follow the Geneva Convention. They have rules, and they actually obey them." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Ludwig sat heavily on a bunk, looking lost. "I thought all captors were the same. I thought this was just what happened when you were captured. You lost everything and hoped to survive." "Not with the Americans," Ernst interjected, joining the conversation. "With the Americans, you lose your freedom, but keep your humanity. It's a strange distinction, but it matters." The contrast between Ludwig's experience and Werner's crystallized something important. The Americans could have been like the Soviets. They had the power. They'd won the war. They could have brutalized their prisoners with no real consequences. But they chose not to. They chose deliberately and consistently to follow rules that protected even enemy soldiers, even men who'd fought for a monstrous regime. "Why?" Werner asked Ernst later. "Why do the Americans care so much about following these rules?" Ernst had been thinking about this for 2 years. "I believe it's because Americans are idealists," he said finally. "They need to believe they are good, not just strong, but morally right. If they violated the Geneva Convention, if they treated us the way the Nazis treated their prisoners, it would undermine their entire self-image. They fight for democracy, for human rights, for civilization. To abandon those principles, even toward enemies, would be to admit those principles are meaningless, so they cling to the rules, even when the rules are inconvenient, because the rules are what make them different from us." It was a damning assessment, but Werner couldn't dispute it. The Americans were better than the regime he'd fought for, not because they were a superior race or a stronger people, but because they'd built a system of laws and then actually followed those laws. It was the most basic requirement of civilization, and Germany had failed it spectacularly. Winter came again. 1945 became 1946. The war had been over for 9 months, but Werner remained a prisoner. He didn't resent it particularly. The camp was tolerable. The work was honest. The letters from Anna came more regularly now that the war was over. She was working as a secretary for the American occupation authorities in Heidelberg. The pay was minimal, but it came with food rations. She was surviving. She was waiting. That was enough. In March 1946, repatriation orders finally came for Werner's group. He would be shipped back to Germany in April, processed through a repatriation center, and released. After 16 months in American custody, he would go home. The night before they left, Werner sat with Ernst and Ludwig and a dozen other men, smoking cigarettes bought with the last of their camp scrip, talking about what came next. Germany was broken, occupied, divided. The future was uncertain, but they would face it as free men, carrying with them the personal possessions the Americans had allowed them to keep. Werner touched his wedding ring. In 16 months, no American had tried to take it. No American had torn Anna's photograph or thrown it away. These small acts of decency, these tiny adherences to written rules, had made all the difference. "I'll tell Anna about this," Werner said, "about how the Americans treated us. She won't believe it at first. No one will. But it's true." "Tell her," Ernst agreed. "Tell everyone. Because the alternative, what the Soviets did, what our own government did, that's the easy path. Cruelty is always easier than decency. The Americans chose the hard path. That should be remembered. The journey back to Europe was the reverse of the journey to America. Liberty ship to France, processing at Le Havre, trained to a repatriation center in Bavaria. At each stage, Werner's ring and photograph stayed with him. At each stage, American personnel followed their procedures with bureaucratic precision: name, rank, serial number, personal effects confirmed, paperwork signed. The repatriation center was chaotic, thousands of men being processed simultaneously, former prisoners and former soldiers and displaced persons, all trying to get home. Werner waited 3 days for his final clearance. On the third day, he was called to a desk where an American officer reviewed his file one last time. Personal effects accounted for? The officer asked through a translator. Yes, sir, Werner confirmed. The officer stamped a form and handed Werner his discharge papers. You're free to go. Good luck. That was it. No ceremony, no grand pronouncement, just paperwork and freedom. Werner walked out of the repatriation center with Anna's photograph in his pocket and her wedding ring on his finger and nothing else to his name. But it was enough. He hitched a ride on a truck going north, then walked the last 20 kilometers to Heidelberg. The city was scarred, but standing. The castle ruins on the hillside looked the same as always, though the city below had been bombed repeatedly. Werner found his way to Anna's parents' house, his heart pounding, not sure what he'd find. Anna answered the door. She'd lost weight. Her face was thin, her clothes worn, but her eyes were the same eyes from the photograph. She looked at him for a long moment, as if confirming he was real. Then she threw her arms around him and held on as if she'd never let go. I kept the photograph, Werner said when he could speak. The Americans let me keep it. All this time. Anna pulled back just enough to look at his hand. And the ring. Werner nodded. They let me keep the ring too. They had rules about personal possessions. They followed the rules. Anna laughed, crying at the same time. Only you would come home from a war and be impressed that the enemy followed their rules. But Werner was impressed. It had mattered. In the darkest period of his life, surrounded by enemies, cut off from everything familiar, those small items had been anchors. The photograph reminded him who he was. The ring reminded him who waited for him. The Americans could have taken them. They had every reason to. But they hadn't. They'd followed their rules instead. That night, lying beside Anna for the first time in over 2 years, Werner told her everything. The capture, the processing, the camp, the work, the slow realization that the propaganda had been lies, the way the Americans had treated prisoners with bureaucratic correctness rather than brutality, the comparison to Ludwig's experience with the Soviets, the importance of small mercies. Anna listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We were told the Allies were monsters, but they weren't. Or at least the Americans weren't." "And what does that say about everything else we were told?" "It says we were lied to," Werner replied. "About everything." They lay in silence, processing the implications. The regime they'd grown up under, the regime that had started a war and murdered millions, had been built on lies. The enemies they'd been taught to hate had proven more humane than their own government. It was a bitter truth, but it was truth. Werner looked at the ring on his finger, barely visible in the darkness. "This is what I'll remember," he said. "Not the war, not the capture, but this, that even in the worst circumstances, someone chose to follow the rules. Someone chose decency over cruelty. That matters more than all the propaganda in the world." Anna took his hand. "Then we rebuild from that. We start with small decencies and build something better." It was an optimistic assessment for a country in ruins, but Werner had spent 16 months watching Americans choose to follow inconvenient rules. If they could do it, maybe Germany could learn to do it too. The years that followed were hard. Germany was divided, occupied, impoverished. Werner found work eventually, rebuilding homes destroyed by bombing. Anna kept her job with the occupation authorities. They survived month to month, never comfortable, but never starving. The American occupation brought its own tensions, but Werner never feared brutality. The Americans maintained their strange adherence to rules and procedures. They could be frustrating, but they were predictable. That predictability was its own form of mercy. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was established in the Western zones. Werner and Anna had 2 children by then, a son and a daughter, born into a new Germany that was trying, haltingly, to become something different. Werner told his children stories about the war, carefully and honestly. He told them about being captured, about the Americans who let him keep his wedding ring and photograph, about the importance of laws and rules and human decency. Your mother's photograph and this ring, he'd tell them, showing the worn gold band. These survived a war because someone followed the rules. Remember that. Rules are what separate civilization from barbarism. When people choose to follow rules, even inconvenient ones, even toward enemies, that's when you know you're dealing with civilization. His daughter, Anna Marie, asked him once if he hated the Americans. Werner thought about it carefully. No, he said finally. I fought against them. They imprisoned me. But they also showed me what principle looked like. They followed their laws when it would have been easier not to. I can't hate someone for being more decent than they had to be. The ring stayed on Werner's finger for the rest of his life. It became thinner over the years, worn down by decades of work and time. The photograph of Anna, taken in 1944, when the world was ending, faded and creased despite careful storage. But Werner kept it in the same wax paper, in the same wallet he'd carried as a prisoner. When asked in his later years about his experience as a POW, Werner always came back to the same point. They let me keep my wedding ring and my wife's photograph. It seems like such a small thing, but it wasn't small. It was proof that even in war, even between enemies, there could be rules, there could be decency. The Americans could have taken everything. They chose not to. That choice mattered. Werner died in 1998 at the age of 77. Anna followed him 6 months later. At Werner's funeral, his son Thomas spoke about a man who'd seen the worst of human nature but chose to remember the best. He fought for the wrong side, Thomas said. He knew that. He lived with that knowledge his entire life. But he also experienced something that gave him hope. He experienced enemies who treated him with decency, who followed rules when they didn't have to, who let a young soldier keep his wedding ring and his wife's photograph because those things mattered even in the middle of a war. My father said that taught him more about civilization than any propaganda ever could. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of Werner Hoffman was one of hundreds of thousands. German prisoners of war held by the Americans were, by and large, treated according to Geneva Convention standards. They kept their personal possessions. They received adequate food and medical care. They were paid for their labor. They were allowed to correspond with family. These were not acts of unusual kindness. They were the bare minimum required by international law. But in a war that saw systematic violations of those laws by multiple powers, including Germany itself, the American adherence to the rules stood out. The wedding rings and photographs that German POWs kept throughout their captivity became symbols of something larger. They represented the idea that even in the depths of war, even between bitter enemies, there could be limits, there could be rules, there could be decency. These small objects, protected by bureaucratic procedure and international law, were proof that civilization had not entirely collapsed. For men like Werner Hoffman, raised under a regime that celebrated power and disdained law, the experience of being treated correctly by their enemies was transformative. It didn't erase the war, it didn't absolve Germany of its crimes, but it demonstrated that a different way was possible. That strength did not require cruelty, that victory did not require brutality, that you could win a war and still treat your defeated enemies as human beings. The propaganda had promised monsters. Reality delivered bureaucrats who followed rules, and in that gap between expectation and experience, thousands of German soldiers learned a lesson their own government never wanted them to learn, that the rule of law was not weakness. It was civilization's highest achievement, and maintaining that law even toward enemies, was what separated democracy from barbarism. When the last German POW left American custody in 1946, he carried with him whatever personal possessions he'd managed to preserve through the war. A ring, perhaps, a photograph, a letter. These objects, protected by international law and American compliance with that law, were more than mere possessions. They were evidence that even in the worst circumstances, even in the midst of total war, humanity could persist, rules could hold, decency could survive. It was a lesson worth remembering, a lesson that Werner Hoffman carried with him for 52 years after his liberation, symbolized by a thin gold band on his left hand and a faded photograph in his wallet. Small things, but in the context of total war, small decencies become profound statements. They become proof that the world, however broken, can be rebuilt on something other than power and fear. They become hope. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today.